which pernicious custom there for a successful actualization of every promising beginning is very widely spread. Then also such a good beginning as this trusteeship for the general welfare of contemporary three-brained beings began, as they say, to crack at the seams. Those petty intrigues of theirs proceeded in full between the separate parties as well as between the separate members of that absolutely indispensable state organization, just at the time I arrived with my first Russian acquaintance in the chief place of existence of the said community. When those upstarts, who had accidentally received power, learned that many of the counsels and indications on the business of improving the organization proceeded from me, that is, just from a professional like themselves, but who was not included in their so-called corporation, well, just then, understanding well that none of their intrigues and subterfuges could have any significance at all for me, they directed them against the head of the trusteeship chosen by themselves. It is, apropos, very interesting, lightly to remark here that although every kind of data for bringing forth various being impulses which they should have are in general feebly crystallized in the presence of these contemporary professionals there, then the data which brings forth the impulse called corporate feeling, for some reason or other, is crystallized and functions in them very strongly. And so, my boy, as long as I did not yet know that to be occupied with intrigues and dodges, or, as sometimes they themselves still express it, mutually to get rid of each other, is already unavoidably inherent in power-possessing beings of this community, I still hoped for and patiently awaited that time when eventually the corresponding conditions would give me the possibility of actualizing my fundamental aim, namely the possibility of proceeding with the elucidatory experiments on the psyche of the terrestrial beings en masse. But when it became definitely clear to me that here in this community, under the existing conditions of reciprocal relationship, it would be impossible for me to succeed in this, I also became convinced that it was impossible to get one's own chemical laboratory there honestly, i.e., strictly according to the laws fixed in this community. I decided to remain there no longer, but to depart, in order to seek suitable conditions for my said aim, to some other European community. When my first acquaintance, the important Russian, learned about this decision of mine, he was greatly grieved. Greatly grieved also were yet several other Russian beings who indeed wished more or less good for their fatherland, and who, during this period, had had time to become clearly convinced that my knowledge and my experience might be very useful for their fundamental aim. On the day of my suggested departure, this trusteeship was preparing to open the big building, which, as I have already told you, was just designed for the aim of the struggle against alcoholism, and which the beings there on the day of its opening called by the name of their Tsar, the People's Building of the Emperor Nicholas II. On the eve of my departure, my first acquaintance, the important Russian, came to me unexpectedly, and having sincerely expressed his regret at my departure, begged me very earnestly to postpone it for several days, so that after the consecration and opening of the said building, he might travel with me and incidentally rest a little from the recent bustle, intrigues, and subterfuges. As I had no special reason to hurry, I agreed and postponed my departure for an indefinite time. 2 days later, the opening of this building took place, and having the previous evening received what is called an official invitation, I betook myself to that ceremony. Well, at this general state solemnity, of the contemporary many-millioned community, to which came even he himself, as they call him, His Majesty the Emperor. There began there, in respect of my person, what is called urestak nil karuni, which, generally speaking, always flows from the totality of the surrounding abnormalities and being formed automatically in the psyche of every one of the three-brained beings of this ill-fated planet, holds them, so to say, in an exitless magic circle. And the further events proceeded in the following order. On the day of the said state solemnity, while the ceremony was still proceeding, my first acquaintance, the Russian, suddenly ran towards me, shoving his way through the beings who appeared there in all the blaze of various what are called orders and regimentals, and in a joyous voice told me that I was to have the happiness of being presented to His Majesty the Tsar. Having said this and speaking rapidly, he hurried away. It turned out that at this solemnity there, he had had some conversation with the Emperor about me, as a result of which it had been decided that I should be presented to him. Such a presentation to the Emperor, Tsar, or King is considered there as a very, very great piece of luck. And that is why my acquaintance, having received such permission, rejoiced beyond words on my behalf. Evidently he wished by this presentation to give me great pleasure, and by this to calm his own conscience, as he considered himself to blame for my unsuccessful stay in this capital. After this event 2 days passed. On the third morning, looking by chance out of the window of my lodging into the street, I saw there quite an unusual commotion. Everyone was cleaning. Everywhere there was sweeping. Many of what are called the gendarmerie and police were walking up and down. To my question as to what caused all this, our Ahun explained to me that on that day in our street, the arrival of a very important general of that community was expected. On this same day in the afternoon, while I was sitting at home and talking with one of my new acquaintances, the concierge of the house came running into me, agitated and bewildered, and stammering, exclaimed, His Excellency. But he did not have time to finish before His Excellency himself entered. As soon as the unfortunate concierge saw him appear, he appeared as if struck dumb by lightning, and then, having pulled himself together, he hurriedly, as it is said there, backed out of the room. But His Noble Excellency himself, with a very friendly smile, although with a shade of what is called hauteur, characteristic of all the power-possessing beings of that community at that time, came towards me, at the same time examining with great curiosity the antiques which were in my room, and shaking me in a special way by the wrist, sat down in my favorite armchair. Afterward, continuing to examine the antiques, he said, "You will in a day or two be presented to our great autocrat, and since it is I who attend to these affairs, I've come to you just to explain to you how and what you must do on such a great and important occasion of your life." Having said this, he suddenly stood up, and approaching what is called a china figure of old Chinese workmanship which stood in a corner of my room, he exclaimed,